everybody. Normally we say, hey, Pete. Let's try it one more time. Hey, everybody.
Hey, Pete.
Much better. Welcome back to part 2 of customizing Xavier, Professor X. Last time when we met, we went over the sculpting, so today we're going to go over the painting and the final details. And throughout the video, I'm going to skip ahead where I'm just blocking in color. Don't worry, I'm not doing anything spectacular while I'm doing this, so you're not going to miss anything. So I just blocked in all of the black. I like to get a nice base coat, and from time to time I'm going to flash up the colors, what we're using, so you know exactly what I'm doing. I used a Mars black. This way, when I go over it, it's going to give it a little bit more of a depth to it. So last video I talked about how I make tons of mistakes, and you're looking at one right now. I am sanding down after I've already started painting, which is just a huge no-no, especially in the middle of it. The paint that I'm using is acrylic Liquitex, so it's not really meant for the models, but I like it because you can blend the colors a lot more easily than you can with some of the ones that are made for models. The problem with it typically is that it's not as it's more of a solid. It's more of like a jelly kind of feeling, more buttery than the testers and liquidy. So when I'm sanding down on that buffer, it gets all of this huge fuzzy stuff, which on this figure works because he's an older figure, but if you're looking for something more crisp, you're going to have a problem. So there I'm using a neutral gray value 5 to go over the black on the pants. Again, you're going to see that I'm going to cut out here in just a second. I'm kind of almost using a dry brush technique where I use a very little bit of paint, and I want to be able to not completely cover it. I still want some of that black to show through to give it a little bit more depth, which also gives it more of an appearance of a cloth. What I do not like with the action figures is when they're so shiny. So you can see it's a little bit less shiny than it used to be. Again, I'm super impatient, so what I'm doing now is I'm about to sand down the knees. Since this figure is meant to be posed sitting down, that the way the knee is sculpted, he's supposed to be posed standing up, and it looks great, it works fine. But as soon as you start bending the knee, you see that you just see the joint. It's very, very obvious. So I'm sanding that down a little bit to make it more smooth. And it was something that was an afterthought. While I was painting the trousers, I thought, that's really, really obvious. So this is part of me just making mistakes. But like I said, we're going to learn together. If you watched the first video on the sculpting, you know that I don't know a whole lot about this stuff, and I'm just kind of figuring it out. And hopefully you're going to see that my skill is going to improve as we go along. If not, just have fun laughing at all of the dumb mistakes that I'm making. This one, however, this Professor X, I've gotten a lot of compliments, more so than I normally do on this one, because I think of the realism. And I apologize, I'm showing you how I'm painting the clothing, and at the end you're going to see what the face looks like, so you can really get a feel for the painting. And I didn't, next time around I'll go ahead and I'll show you how I painted the face, and I think that's more of the impressive part of it. What I'm doing right here is I'm just taking a brush with no paint, and I'm trying to wipe off some of the particles, the dust on it, so that it's just looks a little bit more smooth, and I don't get any of the part from the Dremel bit, the like buffer part, stuck to the paint. So I'm just trying to get some of that off. And so far, all I have on there is a nice coat of black, and I watered it down to use a wash so it really gets into those crevices. And I find when you're painting, what you don't want to do is make everything one color. One of the biggest mistakes is laying down just one color and calling it a day. That's not how things look. If you look at anything, you look at the jeans that you're wearing, they're multiple colors. There's usually at least two, if not three or four colors in just about everything. So you're going to find that when you put a base coat and then go over it, it's going to look a little bit more vibrant. So what I'm doing right now is I'm mixing the color for his uh, sweater jacket that he's wearing, and I took some hooker's green, some cad yellow medium, and then a burnt sienna to try to get that muddy green color that he wears. And everything that he wears in the movie is very drab and very dusty. Looks like he's been out in the desert for a while. And that's what I'm trying to recreate. And you might say, like, why are you using the red when it's primarily green? And whenever you want to dull out a color or gray out a color, you use the color's complement, which means that you're using whatever's on the opposite side of the color wheel. So if it's green, you want to use a red. In this case, I'm using a burnt sienna. If it's yellow, you use purple. If it's blue, you use orange, and then of course for the oranges you use blue, and etc. But by doing that, it makes things less vibrant. So if you look at the green that's unmixed there, if I were to put that on the figure, it would be hideous, and it would just be overpowering. So just a tab of the complementary color really helps make a difference. There, I'm putting some Naples yellow to kind of dull it out a little bit more. But if you look, it's still very bright. It's kind of a Kelly green, which is very springtime kind of green. And if you look at the reference photo that I'm using, he's not springtime. He's definitely more dusty, desert, old, that feels like that sweater's probably been with him for 30 years. It's an old man sweater. So what we don't want to have is something that is like a spring kind of feel to it. You don't want to have something that screams Easter when we're talking about a movie like Logan, where it's just all washed out and old, and that's the whole point of the movie. So I've already put down the black, and now I'm just going to start putting down some of the green. And as I block out the color, I'm doing a pretty even coat on here. It's going to skip forward in a minute, and really all I'm doing is just going through and putting an even coat on there to make sure that we have a nice clean covering. So even though I've mixed three or four colors and I'm putting it on top of my black, that is not going to be the final product. So you look at it right now and you say, wow, that's awfully bright. And even though the color itself might be right, the value is completely off. So I'm aware of this, but I just wanted that dull green there, and I'm going to do something like that, something to take care of that in just a minute. One of the things I did not do with this figure, but it's definitely recommended, especially if it's a figure that you plan on posing a bit more, is that you pop out the joints whenever possible and sand them down a little bit so that you don't get that scrape every time you would move the joint. If you were to bend it backwards and forwards after it's painted, a lot of times it's going to scrape right off. And especially if you have a color that is significantly different. For example, if the original action figure happened to be red, every hint of that would show up. So I didn't do it here. I skipped a step, but that was partly because I knew that I'm not really going to be moving him. I'm going to put him on in one pose. He's going to stay there, and that's it. So now I wanted to dirty up the wheelchair. I didn't get a great sense of what color exactly the wheelchair was, but I knew it was old and it was dirty. So right now I'm just taking some black, and I've got a very loose brush, one that it's almost impossible to get precision with. And I'm just swiping it back and forth. I'm trying to be somewhat random, but still get a good coverage without completely covering everything. I want some of that red to still show through. Not going to be my final color, but I don't want it to be all black either. So I'm going through and just dirtying everything, including the silver, the gray. I really want the feeling that this has just been out in the desert. Now what I'm doing is I'm taking the same color that I used for his jacket, and I wanted some of that dusty feel to be on there as well. And I'm using somewhat of a dabbing technique. It looks like I'm going back and forth, but I'm also kind of stabbing my brush at there to get this random feel. Again, I don't want to completely cover what's underneath. I want that feeling of just dusty. It's been there for forever. And I'm going to go back over it a little bit with the black to cover it up some. But now it kind of has more of an old canvasy feel on the red parts. And it's important when you're going through this to make sure that you also don't miss huge chunks. It's okay if you don't put paint everywhere, because that's not what this is supposed to look like. It's not supposed to be perfectly uniform, but you don't want something completely unpainted, a big chunk of it, because it's going to scream plastic, and we're trying to get out of the look of being plastic here. As you're going through, it's also very important that you that you clean off your brushes, and you don't need to do a lot with that. If you don't have a brush cleaner, just get a cup of water. One of the nice things about latex is that it cleans so easily. You can really get it off without too much of a problem. So make sure you're cleaning in between, and then store your brushes face up. One of the things, I've ruined so many brushes because I've just left them in the water and come back the next day, and they're just absolutely bent out of shape and irretrievable. Here for the shirt, I'm using a Prussian blue, which is a very dark blue, but it almost borders on a purple. And to cut that, I mixed it with a little bit of the black, a little bit of the gray, because I want to dull it out again. And I want a darker color, but it needs to be drab. It still needs to be looked like it's been washed 100 times, and it's been in the desert, and it's also been worn by an old man, and maybe it hasn't been washed in far too long. So we want that feeling of old. Everything about him should feel old and worn and threadbare and sad. So let's see, just going back over, making sure that I have clean coverage. And now we can see what he looks like. It's starting to come to shape. It's almost done, but not quite. We're missing a couple of key steps here. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking some raw umber and I'm watering it down significantly. So really it's just a wash, and I'm putting that over the green coat to get a nice even coat, but with still letting a lot of that green show through. And when that's done, it's going to give it a nice effect. One, it's going to fill in all of the crevices when you do a wash, so it really brings out the detail in the sculpt, and it helps it feel bigger than it is. If you see if you ever see something that's unpainted, it feels very shallow. And when you put the wash in there and it fills in all of the crevices and the cracks and the divots, then all of a sudden it starts to feel deeper and more shadowed and more real. So adding a wash to this really almost completes the piece. If you were doing something that was brighter, I would recommend a final step of doing a dry brush of highlights in very, very small locations. This one I didn't want any highlights. I kind of wanted it all to be dull. But if you do want something to pop out a little bit more, do the wash, and then at your final step, just take a very, very little bit of paint, let it dry where it's almost tacky. You don't want it to drip all over the place. and then go back and just hit some of those outer edges so that it pops out more. What I'm doing right now is I'm doing some dry brushing on the metal portions with an iridescent rich silver, and that'll help it look like metal. Whenever you want to do metal and make it look like it's more real but not completely shiny, you do not want to have a completely clean silver look. Nothing looks like that. What you typically works really well is do a mixture of black and silver. If you think of a flagpole that's been out in the elements for a long time, you don't think of something bright and chrome. You think of something a little bit weathered, and the combination of the black and silver really works well for aged metal. And you'd be surprised how much just a little bit of paint application absolutely transforms something from looking plastic to looking like it's made of a different material. And I'm just hitting just little bits here and there. What I don't want to do also is I don't want to have too much of anything anywhere. I want just little hints of it so it feels like it's real. Little parts where they might have been rubbed clean a little bit more, and just have them show up. Now, in the movie, he's wearing a plaid shirt. It's a blue and gray plaid shirt. So I'm taking an angled brush in here, one that's used for drawing straight lines. And I'm not being super clean about it, but I just want to suggest the idea of a plaid shirt. Not necessarily have it be perfect, but just when you're squinting, you get that feel of it, especially when you're working this kind of scale. If you're going in for super heavy detail, unless you just want to kill yourself and really get in there, you're not going to see all of it. It's not going to show up typically. So you kind of suggest it in broader strokes, and you have a couple of fine lines here and there. Make sure they show up. Don't overblend it at all. And then suddenly you have something that at first glance looks like it's completely plaid. One of the cool things is that your eye fills in what it thinks should be there. So when you suggest certain things, you put in a couple of crisp lines, your mind will just assume that there's other crisp lines there, and unless you really examine it, or if somebody else really examines it, they're not going to notice the difference. So here we have the completed figure. That's really all there is to it. It's not all that difficult. Just make sure you put layers. Layers are your friends. And we have the final figure here posed in front of the Extreme Sets ground pack. I absolutely love them. They bring your figures to life. And you can see the weathered, the aged feel. The head, just a couple of colors there. The Tester's light, the Tester's warm, and some raw umber for the shadows. Well, I hope you enjoy. Next video up is probably going to be a tutorial on some of the dioramas. So feel free to comment and tell us what you think. If you have any questions that I didn't go over, I'm more than happy to answer them. Here is a final comparison shot of where it started and where it ended. So I really want to thank you for joining us. I hope to see you again and hope to hear from you in the comments. Let us know what you think. And remember, respect your shelf.